We just moved all the way from the West Coast to the Midwest. We had trouble finding a place to stay since we had such a huge family. So one of our uncles let us stay in the other half of his duplex. It was a 2-story giant house. Anyway, we were the kids playing in the basement at 1 or 2 a.m. and we see this door that we had never noticed before. We dared each other to try and open it, but no one would, since we were all scared. The next morning, we told my grandfather about the room. He goes into the basement and opens up the door, which was just a small room. But I remember it being really dark in there. The only light that came into the room were the small amounts of light from us opening the door. He takes a look into the room, and I remember him saying, "You stay right here." Not talking to me, of course. He got my father and then quickly went to the farmer's and got a chicken. My grandfather was a traditional shaman, so he respectfully gave thanks to the chicken and killed it. The chicken blood was collected into a bowl. He got the shaman hat and finger bells. He put on the hat, which covered his entire face, and proceeded to open the door. With the finger bells in one hand and the bowl of chicken blood, he goes in there and says some incantation and places the chicken blood in the room. He comes out, closes the door, and then he starts doing his chants, and you can hear the bowl moving. It had this spinning kind of sound to it, and when it finally stops, my grandfather opens the door again. As his chants get louder, it also echoes more. We weren't allowed to see what was happening in that room during the exchange, but his finger bells sounded like he was walking into a corner. He comes out with the bowl that had a small amount of chicken blood left, and what looked to be a little hand-stitched doll with red twine around it in the blood-soaked bowl. I remember clearly the little doll was soaked in blood. He takes a match and lights the doll on fire in the bowl. He tells my father to make sure to bring it outside and don't let the fire die out until he gets outside. I don't know how the bowl with the chicken blood was on fire. I doubt chicken blood would catch on fire, so the only thing I could think of was the doll. Once my father left, I got a look into the room, and you can faintly see that most of the chicken blood is splattered around the room. We had to clean it up later with flashlights because the room was so dark and the blood was smeared all over the walls. A few days later, in the middle of the night, I hear my mother and father panicking. There was a ton of smoke in the house. We went out of the room to check out what was happening, and my father was running back and forth from the bathroom to get the pail of water to where the smoke was coming from. My mother grabbed all of us outside and called the fire department. We all got outside except my grandfather, who was nowhere to be found. My dad quickly ran back into the duplex, and for what seemed like hours, came out carrying my grandfather on his back. Somehow, my grandfather had his shaman hat on, which puzzled me. I asked my father a few years ago, after grandfather had passed away, about where he'd found him. My dad said the smoke was coming from near the basement. He found my grandfather in a deep trance facing a wall. He quickly got my grandfather out of the trance and carried him out. It was weird, since the firefighters said the fire must have suffocated itself to death because they couldn't find a fire at all. However, the walls in the kitchen and in the basement were all smoked afterwards. My father said a bad spirit was trapped in the room. My grandfather is the only one that knows why it was trapped in there, so I can't tell you why it happened. Was the ritual necessary? My grandfather would never do rituals unless he had to. It's been very tiring on the ancestral spirits and the body to keep doing rituals. He wouldn't do one unless he knew he had to. Spirits like these don't just go away naturally. Even today, if I were feeling ill, a shaman would most likely tell me to seek medical attention, unless my soul were missing or wounded. There's a big difference in being physically sick and having your soul wounded or missing. The past summer, my family and friends took a trip to a resort in the mountains. It was me, my parents, younger sister, brother, and 2 of my friends. We rented out a pretty big condo in the resort that had a balcony. One night at around 1 a.m, I was hanging out on the balcony with my brother and 2 friends. We were having a highly philosophical conversation and discussing topics such as existentialism. Ghosts were mentioned by my brother Ash, and I agreed that they existed. One of my friends, Chase, said that he was indifferent on the subject, while my other friend, Braden, said that everything paranormal was total bullshit. Immediately, after Braden voiced his opinions, I felt a presence. It's hard to explain exactly what I was experiencing, but it was along the lines of feeling watched from a very close distance, as if something was directly behind me. Goosebumps shot up my entire body, but I didn't say anything. Shortly after Braden said what he said, he was suddenly feeling extremely uncomfortable. I feel like something is here. What the hell, dude? Do you feel that? He exclaimed. Everyone looked around in shock, and we all confirmed the same feeling. I was a little bit freaked out, but I joked and told him that he shouldn't have said the ghosts were bullshit, because he had clearly pissed one off. Apologetically, he kept repeating that he believed. Braden has a strong mental fortitude, and I genuinely couldn't see why he'd keep trying to mess with us, especially due to the serious nature of our entire conversation. While my level of paranoia stayed the same, Braden's condition seemed to worsen. He said that he didn't feel safe out here and just wanted to go back inside. We all agreed, and right as we're starting to get up, he froze. I think it just communicated with me or something. I'm not shitting you. He started to insist that the time of 2 a.m. was really important, and he didn't know why. At this point, everyone was pretty spooked and felt threatened, so we went along with it. It was around 1:15 at this point, and we tried to brainstorm what the possible significance might be. After a couple of ideas, my brother suggested that we should try and communicate with a Ouija board. This seemed outlandish. We didn't even have one, but Braden said that he could sense that it was the answer. Granted, this all seemed ridiculous, but what happened from here on out only gets crazier. Chase suggested that we just make one, so we did. We got a piece of paper and a shot glass from the kitchen and constructed our own board. We went on the internet and tried to make it as detailed as possible. We came up with a decent recreation, but was still skeptical on the whole situation. I even suggested that we should knock it off and go to bed. Braden wouldn't let it go though. I figured that at least we could humour him, so we all circled around the board in the bedroom. We allowed all the protocols and procedures from the internet and began. We all swore we wouldn't move, etc. And while I'm aware of the ideomotor effect, the following events were certainly convincing. We asked for the spirit's name, and for the first couple of seconds nothing happened. Then the glass slowly began to move. T, then E, then D, spelling Ted, of course. Everyone looked around in pessimistic disbelief. The leader of the circle asked more questions. The spirit told us it had died from an accident. He asked a few more basic questions before asking, "What happens when we die?" The glass felt like it was moving faster this time, and with more force. It quickly spelled out, "Say goodbye." Our next question being, can we say goodbye? With a response of yes. After these events, we all swore up and down that we weren't moving the glass, and asked all sorts of accusatory questions to each other. I mean, how can a Ouija board have really just worked? It didn't make any sense to us. Then a drawer behind us began to open slowly. Everyone was freaked out. I had slept in this room for 2 nights now, and the drawer never opened on its own once. I walked up to close the drawer, and I felt force against my hand, but managed to close it anyway. "Get the camera now," my brother said, and that's when we captured this video, which you can find in the description. You can see that we quickly try to pan over the whole thing, so you can see that there isn't anything pulling the drawer out like a string. In all honesty, it would be rather pathetic of me to spend my time writing this story and fake a video for Reddit. Take that for what it's worth. I've always had an interest in hauntings and magical practices since I was a child. My parents were rigid Catholics, so it was not due to any positive exposure. It's been in my nature never to accept what folks tell me offhand, and to find out for myself. That it was forbidden only whetted the interest. I pursued this academically as an adult, and received a Master of Arts in Western Esotericism from the University of Exeter back in 2011. However, my goal in studying ecstatic and visionary experiences from the measurable views provided in biology and physics. My story starts when my wife and I had returned from teaching in Japan for 2 years, and prior to the start of my studies. At the time, I was working a temp job, where I was paid to do next to nothing. I think I worked a solid 3 days out of every month, without exaggeration. I had a lot of time to waste. The other guy I worked with has been a journalist for the Houston Chronicle, who had fallen on hard times later in life. The man had stories, though he had an odd fascination with Bigfoot. The one in particular that piqued my interest was his account of a local stretch of road the locals called Spook Road. He regaled me with a story he had heard from a friend who was a park ranger. His friend had apparently observed a group of black hooded figures marching in procession through a cornfield to an abandoned barn off the road. One odd characteristic of this haunting is that it's not simply attached to one event, but numerous stories range from suicides, the murders at the Gitche-Montu State Reserve just south of the road, the natives that still perform their ceremonies there, and practitioners of black magic carrying out rituals there. It's a happening place that has been for the span of memories for everyone in the area. Fast forward to when I had begun my studies and was piecing together my dissertation topic. I was considering John Dee's Enochian practices, which I won't go into here. But one interesting detail is that Anton LaVey's Church of Satan made use of Dee's rituals only filling off the serial numbers and replacing satanic references where Dee made reference to God. I was working at Jimmy John's, where I opened what became the freakiest, fastest Jimmy John's in the franchise. The first 4 hours of my shift were alone, and gave me time to plan my papers, while I went about the rote procedure of cutting vegetables, breaking bread, and prepping the cold tables. I was telling my co-workers that I was studying LaVey's satanic rituals, and one of my co-workers, who was usually quiet and a bit zoned out, Maybe it was too much weed, as Jimmy John's had no drug testing, so it was pretty common. Perked up at the mention of this. He asked me what I knew about Satanism, and I shrugged and stated that Satanism was about as dangerous and evil as a fart in a crowded elevator. He seemed put out at this and ended the conversation. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I asked him what it was he wanted to discuss. His stories were disturbing. He stated that there was a group of Satanists that were prevalent in this area. I will be blunt. He claimed that this group kidnapped and murdered folks, and even went about rituals of secretly birthing children in their group for sacrifice. Now, I take ethics rather seriously, and had just had my first son. I felt ill. But what was interesting is that I had a very odd feeling as he was telling me this. I had the very distinct sensation I was being watched. I had told the co-worker about the black hooded figures on Spook Road, and this made his eyes go wide. He stated that this rather disreputable group were connected to the road thanks to its history and its connection to the supernatural. Apparently he went out to Spook Road rather frequently and had a large number of odd experiences. On one trip, he had gone down the road uneventfully, but upon the return of it, the entire road had changed completely, with houses that shouldn't have been there. On another occasion, he had gone out of the road and didn't feel himself. They stopped at a gas station, and when he went to wash his face, when he looked up into the mirror, his face was not his own. While hiking nearby, he also claimed to have run into odd folk, who had odd characteristics where everything they suggested sounded like a good idea, and he felt compelled to agree. I asked him how he'd heard about this group. Having this been purely of his fabrication was a clear possibility. A woman who was, to him, like a surrogate mother, claimed to have been a part of the group, but had gotten out of it after it proved too much for her. However, she stated that she was still stalked by them, and that apparently these folk had the ability to leave their bodies and follow you, which I informed him was typically called astral projection, and could also enter your dreams. This made the sensation of being watched boil over in terror for me. I instantly felt physically cold, and my stomach twisted in knots. What's more, while apparently the abandoned barn they practiced at off the road had burnt down, he believed that they were using the one north of town. The angle of my studies to this point were merely an interest. I held that essentially reality was wholly based on perception, and that there could be nothing to alter it. The notion of these folks having the capacity to alter a person's perceptions, and also the possibility of people willing to murder others so close to home, if any of this were true, kept me up at night, completely unable to close my eyes. My brother is a well-established psychologist who was finishing his PhD at the time, and he is by far the more grounded of the two of us. I decided I needed to talk to him, to get this nonsense that was keeping me up at night out of my head. I shared all the stories I had heard up until this point, only to him have me cut me off and finish my story in greater detail, though he admitted he had heard of no barn, including human sacrifices. He then asked me if I was familiar with a grimoire called the Grimorium Verum. For him to be conversant on something that I'd not heard of in my own studies caught me off guard. I now own a copy of this book, and it's very frankly grisly in its methods, and aims to rather openly centered on summoning Lucifer and his lieutenants. He then stated this book was apparently the key to their practice. I asked him how it's possible he knew about any of this. He stated he was looking into it, because one of his patients at the moment claimed to be a victim of this very same group, and was afflicted with odd forms of dissociative identity disorder, where his alter ego identified itself as a demon. He surmised it had come from a result of his traumatic experience. My brother then went on to say his fellow staff warned him that this group of people were terribly active and would come in at times posing to be victims. He was cautioned to carefully monitor their symptoms for a lapse in the act. This was all too much for either of us, and following this discussion, we did not talk again for months. We both, unbeknownst to the other, simultaneously had been looking at the same phenomena and had each verified each other's findings and fears. He left that counseling group shortly after and focused on helping kids in deeply troubled households. I did what any mature person would do upon realizing his fears could be very real. I went out to their purported place of practice and all associated locales. I'm nothing if not consistent, and do not accept what is told to me. I always look into it directly myself. So I decided to have a look at all of the areas connected to Spook Road. The barn where these people were purported to practice, the road itself, which my co-worker claimed the group had bound a demon to protect them, and the Gitche Manteau State Reserve, just south of the road. Our co-worker warned me that we should not stay there longer than 6 p.m. on recommendation from the woman who claimed to be a former member. Fine with me. I'd rather have a look when the sun's up. As I have said previously, I am willing to directly investigate all of the occult, paranormal, and supernatural. But I am also deathly afraid of it all, but also exhilarated. My father claims I have a very special kind of stupid, and I am compelled to agree. It was late fall, and while it was bearable, over 30 degrees during the day with a jacket, once the sun went down, it was rather cold. We started off by heading off to the barn north of town. I was immediately underwhelmed. It was definitely an old, run-down barn. My co-worker pointed out pieces of twine that were hanging off posts, and took the time to display that they could be used to tie someone up. I quirked an eyebrow, and was rather convinced this kid was caught up in it all, and was seeing what he wanted to see. I still hold that opinion. We then went up to the loft. Squatters stayed here frequently for sure. Socks, underwear, sleeping bags and shirts were all over. I noticed some satanic graffiti, but assumed that folks all came here having heard such stories and had left their mark. I took a step to the left, right next to where a sleeping bag was, and immediately fell through the floor. I managed to catch myself on the support beams and calmly hoisted myself out. I'm a rock climber amongst other things, and nearly falling is no new thing. I only cursed myself that I had managed to injure myself and burden my wife, who was already adjusting to our first little one, over something so broadly ridiculous as a ghost hunt. I deserve whatever was coming to me. We all noted the oddity after that, though most of the floor was too rotten to walk on. Why was a sleeping bag right on it? Also, half of the floor we were walking on had been very recently remade. If a squatter had tried to get in with that sleeping bag, they'd have fallen right through. Puzzling to be sure, but I never got to go back and confirm it at all. As the summer following our exploration, the barn was burnt down in an act of arson that was never solved. This seems an apt time to point out that my co-worker averred that there was a conspiracy afoot as well. He claimed political officials and police were part of this group. Again, I was compelled to think This was him seeing what he wanted to see, but what happened next brought that into question. We headed over to Spruik Road proper. The road had a creek that snakes through in 5 places, meaning 5 bridges. One of the old stories is that when you go across the road one way, you cross 5 bridges, but as you head back, you only cross 4. This, to me, plays on the dull wits of those who turn around on the last bridge and forget to count it. Anyway, there's a cemetery on the final bridge where my co-worker claimed a demon was bound. As we parked on the side of the road near the 4th bridge and walked to the 5th, we spotted a sheriff coming down the road. The 3rd fellow we brought along thought it would be funny to hide behind a tree as he passed. The sheriff thought otherwise and stopped his car and got out. He asked us what we were doing. Previous this, the other 2 wouldn't stop yammering on, but now their tongues had stopped working. I told the sheriff we were out for a hike and pointed to the nearby hiking path. "Why did your friend hide behind a tree when he saw me?" I fought the urge to glare at the dumb kid for doing that, but instead said, "He's an idiot," and thought it would be funny to hide from the cops due to stereotypes. That worked. Just don't cause any trouble. Why on earth was a sheriff patrolling a dead stretch of road no one was on? No cars, no people, just us. Had we only been on it for minutes and had caused no ruckus. We moved onto the cemetery. As we stepped up, suddenly my guts lurched. I felt ill and dizzy. This struck me as odd, because I'd just fallen through the floor without issue, but a dinky cemetery was giving me the shivers. Then the co-worker told me why he claimed this road was bound with a demon. This is where they bury the infants. We walked through to find a felled tree that had been cut up but left there. This is where it gets odd. There was a full can of lighter fluid next to it, and there was very clearly a path down into the bracken. I couldn't make my feet move. I was completely rooted in terror and had no idea why. My co-worker went down and asked me to come down. I couldn't. I looked to our 3rd, but saw, despite his loud claims of atheism and that this was all crap, that he couldn't move either. Why was there a full can of lighter fluid? Fallen trees are terribly cheap to haul away. Why hadn't this been done? We later looked at the history of the cemetery via Google Earth and saw that the tree had been cut down and laid there for years. I'd had enough and said we should leave. The sun was going down at this point. My co-worker said he wanted to show me Gitchi Mantu first, and I agreed, stating we make it quick. It was really cold now, and we could see our breath. My leather jacket was no longer cutting it, and my hands were freezing even with gloves. My co-worker told us about the murders that had taken place here, but the terror in my guts was now gone, and I was unimpressed. At this point, I was using the walk to get my nerves back in order. My co-worker claimed he had seen a black shadow following us, but I rolled my eyes. I had the feeling he was trying to jazz himself up, because he enjoyed this sort of thing way too much. He then showed us a pond that was actually eerily still, which, while neat, had nothing to do with anything. It was when I noticed voices and saw flashlights shining through the pond. I then joked that maybe they were after us. I'm not kidding you. The voices stopped, and the flashlights whipped in our direction. The chase was then on. As we were running back to the car, we ran out of breath near the end, and walked as fast as we could to the parking lot, to see a tan truck parked next to us with binoculars on the dash. It was nearly winter, nearly dark, freezing cold, and not another soul in sight. Why the heck were these people out here, and why did they chase us? After that, I've had the worst nightmare I've ever had, and to this day, I swear it to be, as I state it here, someone else was in my dream. I've dreamt that my wife and I were staying at a haunted hotel, but then the dream suddenly stopped, and a man clipped through the floor. Only the upper part of his face would be seen through the floor, and he locked eyes with me. I then was jackknifed awake, and the words were audible in my head as I sat up in my bed shaking. "We are watching you." I am quite aware of my mental faculties, and this was not merely my nerves. I am very convinced someone else was in my dream. The research of the Stanley Cripper, Montague Ullman et al. In the books Dream Telepathy, perhaps the only viable scientific study on the phenomenon, goes a ways towards confirming this is possible. I have only once been terrified as much as that moment. I lived in a very quiet rural town when I was younger. There was only one stoplight, a Safeway, and one gas station, with little mom and pop shops in between. I lived 35 minutes out of town on a street with only 5 other people on it, all a good walking distance away from each other, meaning you couldn't see your neighbours out your window. It was only 10 or 12 at the time, and my older brother, who had recently got his license, wanted any excuse to take the car out, and me being an annoying little sister, always begged to tag along. I can't remember what we had done, but it was 11:30 at night, and we had just turned on our long winding street. I lived in the Pacific Northwest, so the pine trees tower over you, and can sometimes give you the feeling of being enclosed. And it was a particularly foggy night, so visibility was limited. I was looking towards my brother from the passenger seat, not paying attention to the road at all, when all of a sudden, my brother slams on his brakes hard enough that I nearly hit the dashboard. I had my mouth open, about to yell at him, when I see his face is petrified, with an expression I couldn't pinpoint. His lips were pinched together, nostrils flaring, and I could hear his breathing. His eyes wide open and locked on like a missile to its target. I finally allow my eyes to follow his gaze. In the middle of the street, low fog on the road, were 2 individuals in black robes with their hoodies on. These robes were the real thing, just like the Grim Reaper's, wider at the opening of the sleeves, and the hood completely covered their faces, so we couldn't see anything. We sit there for what felt like forever, just staring at them in our headlights, and then they start to walk towards us. At this point, my scared shitless little self had both hands on my brother's, shaking his arms violently, back and forth, screaming. "Lock the doors, lock the doors!" he cried out. I am! And pressing the lock button, we hear the reassuring sound. These people were crawling towards the car, in perfect sync, stepping slowly at the same time. We watched them as they made their way to the front of the car, and then make the slight turn so they began walking by the driver's side. My brother and I were stuck in fear, just staring as they walked past us and disappeared into the dark of our rearview mirror. We sped home and freaked out, telling our dad everything, who then called the cops, who reported multiple sightings of these 2 and then instructed us not to confront them. We never heard or saw anything about them again, but creepy cult members, I hope we do not meet again. An experience with a Ouija board, which, despite being very skeptical, I can't fully explain away. Years ago, my best friend, another friend, and 3 girls were at one of the girls' houses for Halloween. We were just going to spend the afternoon and evening chilling and watching horror movies. During the afternoon, the girls whose house it was says that she has a Ouija board and that we should play with it. All 3 girls really excited to do it. My best friend is kind of superstitious and very reluctant. Myself and other friend are kind of skeptical, but indifferent about doing it as it seemed pointless. Even more so when she bought it out, and it was some kind of shitty thing she'd made by herself, with a bit of wood and a marker pen, and one of her daddy's whiskey glasses as a planchette. But we were teen girls, and they inevitably got their way. My superstitious friend still wants no part, but the other 5 of us are starting to play. The grimly predictable happens, and it starts spelling things out like show boobs. Almost as if one of the guys was forcing the glass when we had our fingers on it. Me and the other guy found this hilarious. The girls just got annoyed that we weren't taking it seriously, so we all agreed to do it properly. After a bit of random twitching, it starts going 5, no, 6, yes, repeatedly. We took this to mean it wanted the guy who wasn't joining in to join. Note, everyone said at the time and afterwards that they weren't forcing it now, and the rational part of me assumes that they were, but I'm not sure. After much persuasion, the 3rd guy joins us. Again, there is a period of a few random letters or twitching, but nothing coherent. Then it starts repeating a sequence of 3 letters and some numbers over and over again. Suddenly, the guy that joined jumps back out. Out of instinct, we all do the same. The glass falls over and is all steamed up with a cross scratched on the inside. The girls kind of freak out. I explain the glass obviously steamed up because of how we spent long with 6 sweaty teenage hands on a cold upturned glass. It's called condensation and is far from supernatural. The cross was probably a pre-existing flaw in the glass. Dishwasher's scratch. We didn't notice it before, but it became more apparent when the glass had steamed up. Anyway, Guy 3 is now very quiet, definitely not playing again. So we stick a movie on instead. Shortly after, he goes home, clearly not his usual self. The next day he calls me and asks if I'll go somewhere with him. We get a train a few towns over, and he explains on the way. I knew prior to any of this that his dad had run out on him and his mum when he was a baby, and he had no contact with that side of the family, knowing only who they were from photo albums. On the journey, he fills in the gaps. His surname is obviously his dad's. His parents were married, now divorced, and he never changed it to his mum's. His middle name was a family tradition on his father's side, and he had an uncle who died in a motorcycle crash a few weeks before he was born. He knew nothing but his first name and about the accident. From going through the photos with his mum, "Oh, that's your uncle, whatever. He died before you were born." Anyway, the 3 letters were his uncle's initials. It took a while of him repeating them, but it clicked. Obviously, at some point, the sequence contained 2 of the 3 initials registered. Then it hit him. The 3rd one was his uncle's first name initial. He'd asked his mum about it when he got home, but she had little to add. He didn't really know. And we were now on a train to make our way to the cemetery where his uncle was buried in, so that he could see if he could make any sense of the numbers. His mum knew the cemetery from the funeral, but since the divorce hadn't been there. He had never been there before. Note, at this point, the steam and the cross, the bits everyone else found spookiest, I was sure were as per my explanation, and maintained this stance to this day, despite this next bit. I was now thinking maybe everyone else was in on it. Maybe he'd been more curious about his dad's side of the family now that he was older, and had visited the grave recently, and they had all conspired to try and scare me. One of, if not all of the others, forcing the 5, no, 6, yes bit, and him reluctantly joining. The steam and cross were still per my explanation, and just a fortunate coincidence. And now we're on our way to some pre-planned big reveal at the graveyard, which would, in their plan, scare my pants off. We get to the graveyard, wander around for ages trying to find the grave, and eventually find it. And the mysterious string of numbers that followed the 3 letters were the chapter and verse of 2 biblical inscriptions on 2 stones. I have to admit that were I not already onto their little scheme, that would have been pretty clever. I turned to my friend to high-five him and compliment him on what would have been a very clever ruse had I not figured it out. To see him sitting on the ground staring at the grave, then start sobbing. Literally just sat there with tears streaming down his cheeks. Now this guy can lie, and he can prank, and my rationalization of everything else and anyone claims to be supernatural would make me the gold standard target for a spooky Halloween prank. But one thing he cannot do is act. He was obviously and genuinely upset. I just went and sat by him. We sat there for ages, and just went home in silence. This was in the mid-90s. He's still my best friend. Randomly over the years, I've pestered him to do another Ouija board with me, as I'm curious now, as he's the only one I've ever had anything vaguely resembling a result from. He always declines. He won't talk about what happened, not as in the silence treatment, but simply changes the subject. However, not long after that event, he did start to track down that side of the family. He's reconciled with his father and met his half-brothers, etc. I grew up on Guam and attended Harvest Christian Academy, Baptist, from kinder till middle school. My goodness, it was hell. At the time I couldn't see it because I was so brainwashed, but the whole school community was a cult. They brainwashed and forced Christianity onto students constantly, and if you didn't convert, you were segregated from the community. As a Christian school, I would understand that you would want to influence students to your religion, but no way should students feel left out because they have their own set of beliefs. Other really odd things they made me believe was wearing too short of a skirt or shorts was sinful and ungodly, because we were allowing Satan to control our body, to manipulate the mind of our peers. They even made us believe that watching movies that were not rated PG are sinful, and I should stay away from them. Pop culture and music was also not accepted and were banned ungodly. They went as far as saying that students, mind you I was in kindergarten when this rule was enacted, can't bring items with characters such as Pokemon, Powerpuff Girls and Harry Potter, because they are depicted with superpowers that only God can have, and thus it is unholy. The hardest thing to do was finally growing up and realizing how much bullshit was being fed to me, and begging my parents to get me the hell out of there. After leaving, I faced repercussions of old friends turning their backs on me, and teachers looking down and shaming me. Overall, it was a terrible, terrible situation, and I'm so glad I left that place to experience a better high school. Sad thing is that most of my friends I grew up with that graduated from that school still hold the same outlook on life and are still very much involved in the school and its community. Not long ago, my partner and I were driving through reservation land at about 11 o'clock at night in the desert southwest of the USA. We were on a major highway, but as with so many highways in the area, it's not very well used, just barely paved and with only one lane going in each direction. No lights, just reflectors embedded in the pavement. It's not uncommon to go an hour on the highway without seeing another vehicle. I was reading a book out loud when suddenly my buddy who was driving interrupts and pulls off the side of the road, braking quickly. "Did you see that?" "No," I replied. "See what?" "The van! It went off the road!" I turned in my seat, but couldn't make anything out. On or off the road? It was just darkness all around. He grabbed the flashlight that we kept in the car and asked me to call 911. He's in a medical profession and a lapped licensed EMT, and I've worked in emergency response, so this isn't super uncommon for me. Although not even being able to see the accident was a first for me. I got on the phone with 911 immediately and set about trying to find a mile marker using my phone as a flashlight, eventually settling for giving them approximate GPS coordinates, as I had very little coverage and my GPS was acting flighty in that area. The dispatcher asked me to cross the highway carefully and try to ascertain the status of the passengers, since they had gone straight over a hill and presumably into the canyon below. I stayed on the line while I trudged over the sand dunes on the opposite side of the highway. I was a bit nervous to be walking in this area in sandals, as we had just recently been discussing the rattlesnake population in the region, and I couldn't really see where I was going and answer the dispatcher questions at the same time. But the scrubby vegetation gave me some purchase, and finally I crested the largest dune and could see the outline of the accident site. On the road, the moonlight was blocked by the dunes, but on this side, it was strangely bright. It took my brain a moment to make sense of what I was seeing. They had been lucky. The van had turned on its side and slid, and the friction from the dunes had just barely prevented the entire thing from going over the edge into the massive canyon below. My partner called out to me and asked me to check on the woman in the van, and I saw that next to him, standing with a scarecrow-like stiffness, was a young man. He looked dazed and didn't seem to be answering many questions. I got the darkest vibe off that guy that I've ever encountered, and I felt goosebumps crawling up my back, and it was just like there was a permanent ring of shadow around him. I felt very uneasy, knowing that either of us were anywhere near him, and made a point to keep visually checking up on them. I proceeded to the site and around the van, and called out to identify myself. I heard the voice of a woman inside, and as I walked around the windshield, I could see her. She was crouched in the passenger cabin, clearly in shock, her feet bleeding as she shifted back and forth in the broken glass of the driver's side window. A tall, willowy woman, thin and pale, with dark hair. There was also a massive wolfhound, panting. It appeared equally stunned. I saw that they had managed to pry the passenger side window open, and the man must have climbed out through the top that way. The woman spoke to me for a time, calmly, and with an urgency I couldn't quite identify in her voice. I relayed the information to the dispatcher. Yes, it was just the two of them. No, they don't seem to be seriously injured. No, nobody had fallen asleep at the wheel. They were on their way to Texas to visit family. They were living out of the van. What I remember most clearly is that I made a couple of attempts to convince her to either climb out of the roof or through the back to clear a way for the van just to be safe, but she politely refused each time. She said that she didn't want to leave the dog. There was something just wrong with her demeanor. People react differently to stress, but she seemed alert and competent. So I put it to the back of my mind, but I kept being struck by a strangeness in her handling of the situation. Dispatch and I agreed that the paramedics could probably easily break the windshield and free them, and that there was no sign of fuel. So it was fine for her to stay in there until they arrived. Once I double-checked that she was secure and wasn't going to go anywhere, I handed off the phone to my partner while I went out to wave in the paramedics, who had accidentally passed the site and were backing towards us further up the highway, looking for our flashlight thanks to the dispatcher. They pulled off a ways up from the site, and I began to brief them when we all heard dispatch come over the radio. Please be advised that the male passenger is AMS and considered dangerous. AMS stands for altered mental status, suggesting that someone isn't in the normal frame of mind for any of a variety of reasons. We all stopped in our tracks. The paramedics exchanged a glance, and one went back to the ambulance for additional equipment. I was eager to get back to my partner, to make sure he hadn't communicated to that dispatch out of concern for his safety. But when we arrived on site, they were still talking quietly. I went to my car to find shoes for the woman. The passengers were placed in different ambulances, and the police arrived to interview all around us. Just as we were about to leave, an officer taking our statements turns to us and said, "It's real messed up. I guess she was driving and wanted to kill them both, so he grabbed the wheel and overpowered her. It's lucky either of them are alive." After a couple of hours, when we were back to driving, my partner proceeded to fill in the details. When he first got to the scene, the woman was yelling that he had tried to kill her and not to leave her alone with him. She also said that if he got out, he needed to be restrained, as he was a danger to himself and others. The man was very eager to be out of the vehicle. Bewildered, my partner had nonetheless helped the guy pry the door open, and once he was out, the guy had just clammed up and wouldn't do much other than nod or shake his head in response to questions. He kept thinking that the guy might take off and get lost in the desert, but in the end, he had waited. He said the guy had seemed agitated, so he was doing his best to keep him engaged and distracted until help could arrive. It's chilling to realize that what we had thought was an accident was actually a murder-suicide attempt. I really wanted to accompany the woman to the hospital, but for unrelated reasons we couldn't remain. We went back that way during the day on a return trip a week later. We pulled over at the site and climbed over the dunes to see whether they had managed to tow the van over the sand, and sure enough, it was gone. What was unnerving was the realization upon seeing the landscape during the day that if he had chosen any other spot to grab the wheel, for miles in both directions, they would have been over a cliff almost immediately. In the dark, where there was no way for him to tell, he had chosen the only spot where they realistically could have survived the accident. My partner then told me that they had gone off the road when they were nearly opposite our little sedan on the highway. If the guy had opted for a head-on collision instead of off the cliff, we would have been toast. it was a sobering thought. I think of the woman I met that night often, and of her wolfhound, being gingerly coaxed in the back of a police car. I really hope that they are in a much better place now. As for the guy who tried to kill them all, I certainly hope that he gets help, and that we never have cause to meet him again. I've always been somewhat keen to the supernatural. I definitely opened up a door when I was 18 and used a Ouija board. We were all in the backyard of my friend's house. There were about 5 of us, and one of our friends had the glow-in-the-dark board. I was terrified but intrigued. My mother is extremely religious and had always forbid me to use one. So we sat there for a few minutes asking stupid questions and not really getting any answers. But it was a couple of minutes later when I could feel it. Something was there. My hands started to shake like crazy, and of course my friends started to make fun of me, but they didn't know what was going on. I started to hear deep males breathing in my ear. I tried to tell myself it was my friend Megan who was sitting next to me, but she was not close enough, nor was she breathing that hard. In my head, I just said, "Go away, go away, go away," and eventually it did. I can't explain it to this day. It was weird, because as it was happening, I didn't tell anyone. I was just sitting there silently freaking out. As we were all heading back home, I begged my friend Megan to sleep over, because I knew whatever had breathed into my ear was going to follow me back. I asked Megan if she had heard a male's breathing, and she was like, "No," and basically thought I was making it up. For the next month, I kid you not, my house was haunted. I could not sleep without the lights on and music in my ears. I would hear footsteps every night outside my door and periodically wake up at 3 a.m. After a month passed, my mother sat me down. "Ashley, what the hell's going on?" I did not tell her about using the board, because I knew she'd be furious. "Oh, nothing, Mum. Nothing at all." "Ashley, you tell me what's going on. For the last month, I've been hearing footsteps, and last night something scratched my foot." I just looked at her dumbfounded, because I thought this was only affecting me. I basically broke down crying and told her everything. Together we saged the house, said a few prayers, and it's amazing how different the house felt. I felt lighter and pleasant again. Since then, I've been predominantly more aware of ghosts. They usually come to me in my dreams though. If you've ever wondered if Ouija boards work, they do. It might not seem like it's working, but you're literally opening a door, and they won't necessarily make themselves known on the board. And it turns out, another guy had killed himself at the house where we used the board. I collect Ouija boards. I know how strange this sounds. Most people collect stamps, coins, vinyl posters and the like. I should probably preface this by saying I have pretty extensive knowledge of the paranormal. I have been having experiences with it since I was a child. This led me to delve into the world of paranormal investigation in my teen and early 20s, which coincided with my beginning to collect the boards. Since then, I have amassed quite a collection, but there is one that I refuse to even keep in my house. I call it the Salem board. I used to do special effects makeup for films, and I was in Salem, MA for a job. As you have probably gathered, I am a lover of strange, unusual, and all things creepy, so I was thrilled by this opportunity. I had gotten into town a few days before filming began, so that I could prep, but also so that I could do a little sightseeing. I was wandering through some of the shops, and happened to walk into one that had a pretty large collection of Ouija boards. Some were vintage, some were etched glass, and some were burnt wood. At the back of the shop, there was a locked display case which immediately caught my eye. Alone at the top of the shelf was a board that looked as though it was the cross-section of a tree stump. It had the usual markings of a Ouija board, but they looked to be hand-carved into the wood. It was also covered with runes. I went to the guy behind the counter and asked, "How much is it?" "It's not for sale," he said quietly. "Why not?" He looked back at the cabinet and then back at me. "That board is made from a tree that was used to hang witches during the Salem witch trials." I looked at him skeptically. That was a pretty tall claim. I really did want the board though. It would look great in my collection and be a cool conversation piece. "Are you sure you don't want to sell it?" Once again, he looked between me and the cabinet. 150. Cash. No returns. I handed him the money, and he walked into the cabinet to unlock it. He must have noticed the confusion on my face when he handed me the board. It doesn't come with a planchette. The board was not exactly meant to be used. I wasn't exactly sure how to respond to that, so I just said thanks and left the shop. Fast forward a few months, I'm back home in Seattle, in my one-bedroom apartment where I lived alone. I had put the Salem board in a box in my closet, since I was waiting on a new display case and really didn't have anywhere else to put it. My closet had 2 sliding doors and a shelf on top of the bar where you could hang clothes. The shelf was actually pretty large, so it accommodated the box with room to spare. I had gone to bed that night and fell asleep with the television on. I was awoken around 3 a.m. by the sound of something hitting my closet door. I checked to make sure my ball python, Kronos, was in his cage, since every time he got out, he would try and get into my closet, where the hot water heater was. I saw he was curled up under his log, and cautiously opened the closet door to see the box had fallen off the shelf and was now resting against the door. I was puzzled at this, but thought in my sleepiness that I must not have pushed it back far enough. I pushed the box back and went back to sleep. About 30 minutes later, I heard another noise from my closet, but this time it was much louder. When I opened my eyes, I could see that one of my closet doors had been pushed outwards. The box had fallen off the shelf again, but this time had done so with so much force it had wedged between my clothes and the door. At this point I was becoming a bit concerned. Instead of putting the box back on the shelf, I placed it on the floor of my closet and shut the door. When I woke up in the morning, I turned over to grab my phone on the nightstand and saw my closet door wide open. The box had been pushed out into the middle of my room. At this point I became concerned. This was an object with a lot of emotion attached to it, a lot of anger and a lot of pain and suffering. I thought it best to keep it in a box and put the box in my storage unit. A few years go by and my mum keeps bugging me to clean out some of the things from the unit, since she needed some space for her stuff. It was in the middle of summer, and the storage unit was sweltering. I was going through boxes, aimlessly tossing things into piles, when I came across the box. The room was suddenly freezing. I took the lid off and looked down. The Salem board was sitting on top of several other Ouija boards, which I had acquired over the years. They had all been cracked in half down the middle. All of them, except the Salem board. I stared into the box, trying to comprehend what I was looking at. These boards looked like someone had broken them over their knee. Surely not the result of being dropped or jostled. I removed the board from the box and placed it in a wooden chest that I had acquired from my great-grandmother, who had considered herself to be a witch. It remains in that box to this day. I believe there are forces in this world that we will never understand. I am sure you are wondering why I didn't get rid of the board. In a way, I feel tied to it. It called to me, and I answered. I consider myself its keeper. As long as it's with me, everyone else is safe from whatever or whoever is attached to it. For some reason, my aunt decided to play the Ouija board with me when I was 8. I'm 23 now. I don't know why, other than maybe she didn't believe it would do anything. I remember everything so clearly. I was nervous, and as soon as we put our fingers on the planchette, it made a figure 8 symbol. I've read that isn't good. Something about an evil spirit trying to get through. Their spirit said it was a long-dead relative of ours, but I don't know if I believe it in now. We ask questions like how many kids I'm gonna have, or if I'm gonna graduate college, and shortly after that, my aunt's chair breaks and she falls back. I was scared to death. Did we upset the spirit, or whatever we'd summoned? Throughout the years, I've noticed I've had a lot of bad luck. Not just me though, my whole family. I felt like some things changed ever since I messed around with the Ouija board. I used to have bad thoughts and see shadows in the corner of my eyes, and I still do. Maybe I'm just paranoid. I also used to have dreams about demons. I'm just wondering if maybe the Ouija board has anything to do with this. Or maybe I'm just unlucky, because a lot of messed up shit has happened in my life. I was 15 and came home from school. I greeted my 3 dogs like usual and let them outside for a little bit. I decided to play a game for about 30 minutes, and somehow a swarm of killer bees came through. Of the 3, I was only able to save 1. My family wouldn't let me go outside. I had to fight through them. My dogs weren't the only ones attacked by those bees either. I believe a person was also killed. It was a nightmare. Shortly after that, my mum ends up having cancer. Thankfully the chemo worked, but 1 year later, she goes mental. She thinks I'm the spawn of Satan, and I just feel like I'm the most unlucky person ever, even though I try to be positive. I still see shadows, and I always wake up around 3 AM. Whenever I dream, it's a nightmare. It's exhausting to say the least. Life is slowly getting better, and I'm just wondering if this could be the work of a demon or an evil spirit. As someone who has grown up on an infamous haunted plantation, I've never been scared of ghosts. Curious and intrigued, yes, but never scared. In fact, I have gone through a lot of trouble just to go to a haunted house or location. I live in Virginia, so there are a lot of places to check out. There has only been one incident when I've been scared so badly that I'll never ghost hunt again, and it wasn't even anything paranormal. When this particular incident happened, I was 19. My boyfriend at the time and I were very explorative, and we made it into a thing to go around at midnight and go ghost hunting at random places. He lived in Williamsburg, Virginia, so there were lots of places to go. We would go around the Newport News areas as well. Some famous places that we visited were Old House Woods, Crawford Road, Roswell House, etc. One night, we decided we were bored and wanted to get our group of friends together to do some ghost hunts. We've got 3 of our friends on board and got ready to head out for the night. Usually we would smoke a few blunts on the ride, and when we were nice and toasted would we go to our destination. On this night, we decided to check out Roswell, and then on our way back home, we were going to take a detour through Crawford Road. The night started out really fun. We basically couldn't stop laughing the entire night. One of my friends, on the other hand, couldn't shake this bad feeling he was having. He insisted that we go home or get some food at a fast food place. He was also insisting that we skip Crawford Road because it was too out of our way from their apartment complex. Me and my boyfriend were very insistent that we checked out Crawford Road, and since my boyfriend was driving, my friend didn't get a say in the matter. We jumped back into the car, got some McDonald's, and headed to Crawford Road. Crawford Bridge is just this little bridge on a very desolate, creepy road. If I remember the road, it was about 10 miles long. The bridge was where they would go to hang slaves, so the area had common reports of ghost sightings. When we got on Crawford Road, we decided that when we got to the bridge we would get out and get a better look and take pictures. I'll remind you, this is 1:30 a.m. My boyfriend and I were not scared, but I guess the idea of that scared the shit out of my who was already freaking out previously friend. At the time, I thought my friend being scared all of a sudden was extremely strange, because he usually loved doing this stuff. He kept on just saying he had a bad feeling, and that he could always trust his gut. We should have listened, but we were stubborn, and were almost at the bridge. Right as we came around the corner to see the bridge, we saw a car parked on the side of the road. As we got a little closer to the car came on, and so did the lights. We assumed that it was some teenagers checking out the landmarks like we were. But as we were passing them, we saw the outline of 2 older men, and I did see that they were both bald. It sent chills down my spine, so I told my boyfriend to keep driving, and he agreed that we shouldn't stop or get out. We passed slowly, but when we were about to turn the corner for the bridge to be out of view, we saw the car slowly turn around, turn on their high beams, and start following us. At first we were a little freaked out, but you know, coincidences happen. About 2 miles down the road, this car was right on our tail. We decided to go faster than normal to lose him. The speed limit on this road was between 30 and 40, and we were going 65 to try and shake the car. The whole time, the car was so close to ours it was almost touching. At this point, we are officially freaked out. My friend who was originally freaking out was now in tears, and we officially are being chased down by these guys. I felt a lot of relief when I saw that there was a turn onto a highway up ahead. There were almost no cars on the road, so we didn't even stop at the sign. We ran through, and so did the car behind us. We saw a 7-Eleven up ahead, and we thought that if we turned into it, they would just keep going and leave us alone. But no, they followed us right into the 7-Eleven parking lot. We would be the only ones in the parking lot together, and at the time, I didn't think any of us wanted to come face to face with the mysterious bald men. My boyfriend, unexpectedly, punched it out the parking lot, followed by the mysterious car. At this point, we honestly all thought we were going to die. We had no idea what the intentions of these people were, but we knew that obviously it wasn't good, and we have been specifically targeted. Once we got on the road, we were flying. I mean, we hit 100 miles per hour easily. We were all screaming, and I managed to call the police. But I was in hysterics, going in 100, in an area that I wasn't familiar with a car chasing us. At some point, the car got from behind us and got into the other lane. This was a 2-lane highway, and there was no passing allowed on this road. I looked over and thought I saw a flash of something metallic come up from the window, possibly a gun. That's when all of a sudden, my boyfriend slams on his brakes. The other car kept on going at 100, as we quickly try to turn around. When I look back, I see them stopping and also trying to turn around. By the time they turned around, we were already flying in the other direction. Somehow, I'm not sure how, but we lost them. We tried to find the most populated area we could, and once we found a random apartment complex, we stopped the car and we all started crying. My friend who told us we shouldn't go was yelling at us. He was going on about how we needed to be more careful and started trusting our instincts. Let me tell you, I have never not trusted his gut feelings again. This could have gone a lot worse that night, and I'm very thankful that it didn't. Later that month, I had learned that that area was known for gang activity. Unfortunately, I learned the hard way that anything could happen at any time. I was very stupid and stubborn back then. All those times we went ghost hunting, not once did I think there could be a murderer waiting for a group of stupid kids like us to come by. So creepy bald guys on Crawford Road, let's not meet again. I grew up in your basic non-denominational Christian household, both parents being devout, but not overly obsessive, so this is where things took a turn. My dad brought my older brother and I to this evening church service at a new location. I remember thinking it odd, even at the age of 7, that this church was being held in a dimly lit single-floor office complex. On arrival, my father brought us forward to meet the pastor and have him pray over us. This man stood over my brother and I, laid his hand on our head, and started speaking in tongues. I know some sects of Christianity do this. Yet, while he would do so, the whole room of men and women began to do the same, some falling on the floor in seizure-like fits. When the pastor finished his chanting, he spoke to my father and told him that he saw our future from God, and if we remained loyal, we would do whatever we wished. He then condemned us from having any toys, because now that we have been seen by God, the devil would use our toys to carry demons. That night, my dad threw away all of our toys and told us how he saw a man's face turn lizard that night, and we must rid ourselves of demons. The only thing that saved my brother and I from going back was my mother hearing this and forbidding us from ever visiting again. Though my parents separated, I do believe my father returned numerous times to this church. Yet, he now lives in a home, doped up on many mind-numbing medications. I was in 7th or 8th grade when me and about 15 of my friends and acquaintances went into the woods by the highway. To ensure that no one saw that there were kids with airsoft guns and camos shooting each other, we trekked deep into the woods. No highway car could be heard, so we knew it was far enough. We eventually came across this old single-roomed house. The windows were boarded up with wood, and the door had about 5 padlocks, and the pool out the back was green with algae. Grass overgrew any remnants of a driveway through the dense forest. Peeking through the wood boards, we found broken furniture and the floor caked in dirt. The guy who organized the hangout lived nearby and assured us that the owners hadn't been at the house for 10 years. They were old and presumed dead. With no concerns, we finally played airsoft for a few hours. Needing a break, we rendezvoused back at the house. As we approached, we could hear this faint sound of an engine. Nobody could even tell the car was approaching at first because of the thick brush. Sure enough, a black car was rolling around the corner. Pulling up to our group, the driver lowers the passenger window. An old man driving an old man behind him. The passenger was an elderly woman with another elderly woman behind her. Everyone in the car was dressed in all black formal clothes. They practically started screaming at us to get away, literally almost shrieking, but it also sounded angry. We tried to apologize for trespassing, but the driver started reaching for something in the glove box and we all ran out of there. Their eyes were so greyish blue, it was almost transparent. Their hair was whiter than snow. The black tuxedos and dresses were vampiric looking. To this day, I think they were cultists. I'll never know, and I shall never forget. I love road trips. There's nothing more delightful to me than to get up an hour before sunrise and hit the road to a destination some hundreds of miles distant. However, there are occurrences in the wee hours when time gets thin and reality blurs around the edges. I'd like to share 3 of these stories that all share a phenomenon I've come to call the screaming between. The first was during my move from North Carolina to California. I made it in a 4-day blitz across the continental US, which I was pretty proud of. Day 1 passed with no trouble, moving from Goldsboro, North Carolina to Prattville, Alabama in about 12 hours. Day 2, I got all the way from Prattville to Baton Rouge, and I knocked off early to enjoy some bayonets and gumbo. Day 3 was the day I heard it. It was about 4 in the afternoon, with a relatively clear day all around me. October isn't the hottest time in Texas, but my AC had stopped working, so I had the window down. VMV Nation's Nemesis was blaring out of my crappy Honda Civic speakers when I heard a god-awful shrieking. It was like the sound of a big sheet of steel being torn lengthwise. In a panic, I turn off into a small pullout on the side of an I-10, and before I can even begin to figure out what's going on, rain is hitting the car. A couple of drops, then a torrent, and just ahead of me, where the road dips a bit, I see a tunnel of water start. I look to my left down the south, and this massive thunderhead is falling from behind a bottle, and this wall of water is starting to pour across the road. Never saw anything like it before, and I was stranded there for a good 40 minutes as this flash flood poured not 20 feet ahead of my car and across the road. The next time was a road trip to Idaho, from my new home in Mogav. I took the route up through Nevada via Amboy and Vegas, figuring I could do the trip in about a day, since the GPS predicted a 12 to 13 hour drive. The snow was starting to come down. This was a Christmas trip, and a favourite time of year of mine for visiting family and friends. I had gotten roughly halfway there, around the town of Wells. It's honestly a bunch of truck stops and hotels, more of a stopover than a real town, and I was starting to get drowsy. I'd taken longer than expected due to a major traffic hold-up a few hours before, and it was already pitch black around 11:30 p.m. I had just rolled down the window to let a blast of cool air reinvigorate me when I heard it. That same horrifying shriek of sound. I jerked the wheel reflexively and skidded off the road. At exactly that moment, an oncoming semi drifted right into the lane I'd been in. The last story is another Christmas road trip. This time I was going from Mogav all the way to Illinois, and just my luck, a winter storm comes tearing along the I-70, just as I'm getting on it during day 2 of my trip. It was insane. I'd gone from slightly snowy, but mostly clear day in Utah, to near whiteout conditions in under an hour. Now I'm pretty comfortable driving in snow, and my SUV had snow chains and a 4WD in good condition, as I'd replaced the Honda Civic a while back, so I figured I can keep going a few more hours at least. Then of course I hear it. That infernal hell shriek of a sound. This time, I could swear I heard it saying 13, as it screamed through the winter snow. By this time I am entirely out of shits to give when it comes to the screaming, so I hit the next exit and ducked into a hotel, even though it was only 7 PM, and I'd been on the road for less than 9 hours. The next day, as I'm driving, I counted 12 vehicles on the side of the road, overturned and wrecked, each one with massive gashes on the side of the vehicle, like they'd been peeled back by some horrible force. I still love road trips, but part of me is always listening for that screaming sound when I'm driving and between towns. I live on a mountain and have a pretty big backyard. Beyond that chain link fence is what my neighbour calls the gully. I've looked it up, and it really should be called a ravine, but gully sounds a lot better. It's big, a lot more steep, and kind of sketchy. It's a forest of shrub oak and sage brush. Most of the kids avoid it, and adults try to keep curious teens away from it. According to legends, some teens died down there about 30 to 40 years back, and a killer was never caught. It's a pretty small town, but no one was convicted, so it faded to a cold case. I thought it was only a myth to keep us out of the gully. It was home to rattlesnakes and foxes, but I always thought that there was something more menacing out there. So 2 months ago, I asked to stay over at a friend's house. I'll call them Alex. They lived really close to the gully, and I planned to sneak out there. Alex agreed and decided to come with me. That Saturday, me and Alex snuck into the gully. Alex brought a flashlight, and I held the bag with our water bottles. It was a warm night. Most of the walk through the gully was boring. We startled a nest of birds, and Alex saw a deer. It was only when we passed an old stream bed that things started to go south. Alex said something like, "I don't feel so well," and then turned and puked into the bushes. I gave them water, asking if they were all right, and they said that they were fine. I started shivering like crazy too, and I almost threw up myself. My legs were shaking, so me and Alex sat down. We sat there for a minute before I felt something hit my back. I still have a bruise. At first I thought it was just a bug that hit me, but then Alex told me to stop poking their back. Then I heard a voice whisper, "I'm still here." Me and Alex screamed. We started running at full speed back to Alex's house. I looked behind us and saw no one. Another pebble hit my calf, and we ran for cover. Alex has asthma, so we stopped running. It was just me, crickets, and Alex gasping. No footsteps, nothing. We were the only 2 people in the gully, so what was throwing rocks at us? Alex finally said that we were ready to go home, and we started walking back to their house. As we were walking, I found 2 large pits in the ground, probably the same size as a mattress, and a little deeper than 3 mattresses as well. Alex felt brave and jumped down into one, and they told me they found a piece of paper with police tape, along with an old rubber sole and a necklace. Probably just litter, but I don't know what to think considering the rumours. That's when it happened. Suddenly, I couldn't breathe. My jacket hood was caught on something, and I was dangling feet from the ground. Let me repeat myself. At least 2 feet into the air, I was lifted from the ground, and choked. Luckily, Alex yelled at me to raise my arms and slide from my jacket, and we pelted for Alex's house, not stopping for anything. I think the rumor was based a lot more in reality, and they don't want us to see what happens down there. 2 months have gone by, and in that time I've been doing some research. I went back into the newspapers of my town, back to 1982, and found that 3 kids were reported missing. 2 boys and a girl. Timothy, Juliana, and Andres. Doing some cross-checking, I found Juliana and Timothy's gravestones in the cemetery. She was 16. Andres was buried in his hometown, which was a few states over. In the newspapers, I found the address of their families, and I visited Juliana's only sister Marie. After getting to know her, I asked about Juliana. She showed me pictures of her childhood, and then the funeral. It was very hard on this old woman to revisit her younger sister's death, but she told me everything she knew. She, Andres, and Timothy were very close friends in junior high, and stayed friends until the end of their lives. One night, they were at a party and got very drunk. Somehow, the next morning, Juliana was found buried in a shallow grave in the gully, and police combed the whole gully, only finding Andres. He was laying face down in the old riverbed and was dead. The mourning families had Timothy and Juliana's funeral at the same time. In photos of their open coffins, I saw them, and her pale face still haunts my dreams. And Timothy? His coffin was empty. Marie said that she never liked him. He was always so aggressive and a bully. She'd asked Juliana to stop seeing him, but she ignored her. Alex thinks that the ghost of Timothy attacked us. I don't know what to think. I don't know if writing this will change anything, but I still haven't gotten my jacket. What do you think? I thought this would just all blow over, but Alex called me last Friday to meet them at their house. I went right away, and they showed me a Ouija board. Of course, we went into the gully to try and contact Timothy. I don't like Ouija boards, but I set up my phone to record the audio. Good thing I did, because I can't remember what happened from when I touched the planchette to when Alex threw it into the bushes. Since the audio was really hard to understand, I've got the basics of it now. Alex goes, "My name is Alex," and then they spell it out. And I go, "My name is Kay," and spell it out. We are trying to reach Timothy. 40 seconds pass, and I start to feel sick. Then we begin reading off the board. I-M-T-I-M. Oh great, Tim! Don't want to be any trouble, we just want answers. Are you okay with us speaking to you? Y-E-S. We then ask questions, just to further see if we were really talking to Timothy. It seemed to be going well. Tim, what happened in 1982? 90 seconds go by. Nothing. Me and Alex chat a bit about how cold it is, and we want answers. Timothy, what happened in 1982? N-O. Me, laughing. That's not an answer. J-D-I-E-D. 1982. Yes, we know that Juliana died. Who killed her? D-I-E-D-U-D-I-E. To me? What? I don't know. Tim, is anyone else here with us? Like Andres or Juliana? Y-E-S. May we speak to them? No. Why not? They are gone. Alex, angry. Then tell us what happened. Alex told me the planchette shifted to no, but didn't say anything and moved it back to the middle. "Tell us what happened or we'll burn this whole forest." "Stop, Alex." "Burn me, and you'll burn too." "Did you kill them?" Alex repeated this after a minute passed with nothing. Me and Alex looked down. Y-E-S. After we got this far, Alex threw the planchette away, and I snapped out of whatever trance I was in and took off after Alex. We ran back to their house and drove home in silence. When we got there, they just sat in the driver's seat staring into nothing. My phone stopped recording at this point, so I asked if I should play it back. Alex said no, and then told me that they were never meant to touch any Ouija boards again, not even the one we'd left at the gully. I remember asking what happened, and Alex just yelled, asking if I'd forgotten. Alex has anger issues, so I calmed them down and just said goodnight. They demanded to go in with me to get out of the cold, and I made them a cuppa, and they fell asleep. When I listened to the audio for the first time, I heard whispers in the moments of silence. I didn't want to include them in the transcription, because I felt like they were just the wind. I wasn't even going to mention them until I was listening to them while Alex was asleep. I kid you not. Alex also whispered while they were asleep the letters A, D, I, E, D, U, D, I, E, at the same time that we read them in the video. I flipped out. I was really scared. I grabbed the Bible just in case some ghost tried to spook me then and there. And nothing happened for a long time. I woke up Alex and they spent the night. At this point, I don't know what to do. I swear this isn't all made up, although I wish it were. I pray it's just Alex playing a prank. But how can you make this stuff up? So I dabbled with the board as a kid, and nothing really happened. Then I saw The Exorcist, and decided I should probably stay away from the creepy board. Fast forward to when I was about 16. My brother had some friends over, and they wanted to play with the Ouija board. I wanted no part of it, so I went to bed. They were playing in the hallway outside my bedroom. I fell asleep. Then suddenly I was awake, because my TV turns on by itself. So, as I awake, I turn to look at the TV. Very surprised. Then I turn back to look at my ceiling, and my poster comes off the wall and falls on top of me. Like a slow-mo fall. I had it taped to my wall. I guess it decided to stop working at that exact moment after the TV came on by itself. The next day, I told my brother about it, and he said they had the lights turn off, or something like that, while they were playing, and it stopped after that. I thought it was pretty creepy that it affected me, and I wasn't even playing. The other experience I had was in college at my dorm. I got a knock at my dorm door, and it was my buddy, inviting me to come and play with them across the hall. They had a Ouija board, and a bunch of them were going to play it. I told them, no way in hell. I warned them not to do it. But of course nobody takes that advice. I just decided to go to sleep. That night, I had the most horrible dream of my life. I was at this festival, drinking and having a good time, and I'm wandering to the outskirts of the festival, and I realize I see my grandmother's house right outside the gates. My grandma has been dead for years, but I spent a lot of time there as a child, so I have very fond memories of her and her kitty named Hobbs. So I'm like, sweet, it's Grandma's house. I'm gonna have to go and say hi. I go into her house, and it's kind of dark and hard to see anything. But I can make out that she's across the room, and I greet her. Hey Grandma, how you doing? I shout to her. She's sitting in the living room with her back to me, and she tells me to come over. So I walk over and sit down on this ottoman that she's sitting on still with her back to me. So we're looking opposite ways and conversing. I'm asking her how she's been as I'm looking around the house. As I'm talking with my back to her, Hobbs the kitty jumps onto my lap and I start to pet the kitty as I'm looking around the room talking. Then her voice gets raspy and she says in a dark tone, "I'm so glad I've got you here." And so I finally turn to her and I'm like, "What do you mean got me in here, Grandma?" And that's when I see her. It's not my grandma. It's this demon-looking ghoulish thing in my grandma's clothes. So I'm like, "Oh my God," and look down on my lap. The kitty isn't a cat at all, but a huge rat. And just as I see the rat on my lap, I start to freak out and wake up in a cold sweat with my heart pounding. It was the most horrible dream I've ever had. I'm convinced now that spirits can get into your dreams. It just seems so weird that I had such a vivid, horrible dream as they were playing with that stupid board across the hall. I just wanted to get that out and see what you lot think. I visited a friend in Miami back in the 80s. There were 3 of us, and we decided to drop acid and go for a hike in the swamp. We saw many wonderful and strange things, like banana spiders, huge things with massive webs, almost walked face first into one, and all kinds of animals. We reached this quiet part of the swamp where it was darker and the ground was hard-packed black mud with little holes filled with swamp water. There was a clearing in the mud, and a long black wooden dock was built on top of the mud, which ended in like a wooden deck/altar setup. The whole dock was painted in strange white symbols or runes. We were climbing around on it, just trying to convince ourselves that it was real. Silently, out the swamp, about 3 dozen raccoons wandered towards us, completely unafraid. They were dipping their hands in the holes, I guess searching for food. They surrounded us on the dock and passed around and under us in about 10 minutes. There was a lot. They looked at us curiously and kept on moving. I walked to the entrance of the docks and turned around, looking down the dock at exactly the right angle. The white paint symbols connected in perspective of the railing, slates, and wooden decks of the dock to form a huge satanic goat head, the kind you might find in a book of the occult. I showed my buddies, and we got real quiet and moved away from the area. We spent the rest of the trip on the beach surrounded by people and life. I have no idea what the dock was for, and I'm not sure I want to know. I'm going to take you back to the summer of 2010. This year, I had a rush of getting into the paranormal. The fact that ghosts and demons are real fascinated me, and would make my adrenaline pump when I would encounter such a thing. Well, this particular night, my sister-in-law had asked me if I had ever taken part in a Ouija board, and at the time, I had no clue what that even was. So, obviously I never had. She begins explaining to me what Ouija boards are, how they work and such, and then she asked me if I would like to experience it for myself. Of course, just as though my heart had skipped a beat. So we decided that we would do it, and had to find a place in order to do it. Her parents wouldn't let us do it at their house, as my brother and her were only dating at the time, let alone even around the house. So me and my brother decided screw it. I know Mum and Dad won't let us do it inside, but outside on the porch or in the garage shouldn't be a big deal, right? So we go to my parents' house and we start setting up shop on the back porch. We got a candle, matches, pen and paper, and grabbed some chairs around a table and sat ourselves around it. Just as we were starting, my heart started pumping so fast, it was like I was really nervous. Was this really going to work, I wondered? So we all put our hands over the Ouija, and Brittany had one hand over it, and she could write with the other, as she started asking if there are any friendly spirits around us that would like to communicate. The Ouija board moved to no. Then I started freaking out. I'm only barely touching this thing, and I mean my fingers are pretty much hovering over it, with a paper-thin grip away from the planchette, the triangular-shaped piece usually with a small glass circle in the center used to cast over the letters. I asked if anyone was moving it, and they told me to stop messing with them, and I ain't got time for bullshit, and everyone was saying that we're not playing around, and that we want to see this work. Brittany asked Nick to be serious, and to stop playing around. So then Brittany's voice became firm, and she stated that only benevolent entities are welcome here, and any violent entities were not welcome to speak, and they could go ahead and leave, or we would just end the session. So we waited a few minutes, and all placed our hand over the planchette again, and Brittany states again, "Are there any spirits who would like to speak with us tonight?" The planchette slowly moved to yes. So sure, maybe an entity was lying to us, who knows, but we decided to keep going, trying to communicate with the spirit. Brittany asks if there's anyone in particular here that you would like to speak with. The board at this time pretty swiftly moved to yes, and then back to the center. Now usually, you are the ones that would push the planchette back to the center, but this spirit would seem to guide it. The whole time, we were communicating with it. Brittany begins to ask who it would like to communicate first, and the board slowly spelt out Ashley's name. Now Ashley, beginning to get nervous, was asking me, why does it want to start with me? She seemed to be getting nervous and stuff, and I would too if it had specifically wanted to communicate with me first. So Brittany tells Ashley to ask it something, that the spirit could be a relative, or possibly a demon with a liking, and ask a question that only you would know the answer to, and not something that would be easy to guess. And Ashley asked what year the spirit had died, and if it had ever lived. I can't remember the year it spelled out, but I do remember her claiming that it was the year her mother had died, and she began getting frantic and sad, but she was interested. So Brittany told her to ask a question that only her mother would know. I can't remember any of these, but Ashley asked personal questions only her mother would know. Not even any of us would have known, and things started to get creepy. So here, Ashley is becoming very emotional, believing that she is really speaking to her mother, and at one point, one of us would take our fingers off to see if it would just go with 3 of us, then 2 of us, and then just Ashley by herself with the planchette, would still slightly move around, with just Ashley hovering 2 fingers above the piece. Whatever it was had a strong connection with her. I remember the spirit spelling out how thankful it was Ashley found my sister-in-law, that her mother had never left her side and was just happy she had a real friend in her life that truly cared for her daughter. After all that happened, and I mean we spent a good amount of time, maybe an hour, maybe even 2, communicating, Ashley felt like she'd asked enough, and asked her mother to stay with us, and asked if there were any other friendly spirits that would like to communicate with us, and if so, would she watch over. Well, the board went to yes and no. We asked what that meant, and it slowly spelled out evil and good, and that they were good, fought, evil. We thanked her mother and the other spirits for protecting us, and asked her if she would communicate with the others. The board went to yes. So we began taking turns, my brother then Katie just asking random questions, my brother being stupid and asking how he would die, and I forget, but I think the board said age, assuming it was saying old age, and just lame stuff. And the girls all gave him shit, because I guess you're not supposed to ask questions like that. There's some things you shouldn't ask, because you shouldn't know. You should just let them be played out. Well, it gets to my turn, and I couldn't really think of much. I knew I was thinking about asking it if I was going to die young, like my brother had, just to piss off the girls. But to be honest, when I was younger, I never thought I was going to make it past 18. I just felt like I was here for a good time, not a long time. Still kind of feels that way. But I obviously made it past 18 actually, although I barely did. Anyway, I asked if my grandfather was okay, and if he made it to heaven. I got a yes, and a proud response. Then I asked if I was going to be a successful football player. That year, I had just received offers to go play for the Miami Hurricanes and Ole Miss, and wanted to know if I could go pro. The board said yes. I got excited and asked it which offer I should take, which one would be the best for me, and it said Miss. I got excited because that was the school that I wanted to go to, but I also felt like maybe these were easy answers. Maybe it can read what I want, and that's how it's answering me. Who knows if we're still communicating with Ashley's mum. So I asked if I would make it to Ole Miss. The board said no. I got hurt. That shit messed me up. I asked why, and it slowly spelled out accident. I said, what accident? Am I going to be hurt? It said yes. Now everyone was getting nervous, but I was getting pissed at Brittany, reminding me that I was asking questions that you shouldn't ask. But I was invested as hell, and I really wanted to know. It slowly spelled out car and death. At this point, Brittany had enough. I was asking questions I shouldn't, and so had my brother. She didn't like the feeling she was receiving anymore from the energy in the room, and she decided to begin ending the session. Well, that's just what she did. Well, now we'll shortly go as to why I tell this story to warn people about Ouija boards. A year and a half later, in 2011, in my junior, I got a job at a pizza place delivering pizzas after football season to help my parents out of paying my own cell bills, gas and such, and helping them out if they needed it. Well, one night, a car that I still to this day can't remember, I only remember what I was told. I got into a really bad accident while at work one night. Apparently, from what eyewitnesses had told police, and what doctors and police had told me the next morning when I finally gained consciousness, at around 7 or 8 a.m. I was coming around the corner on US 1. It's an old highway down here in Florida, with a bit of traffic following me, and on the other end were 2 cars parked side by side in the median. One of the vehicles, well, the one I hit, was parked in the median, but majority out of the road of the highway. So here comes me and a bunch of traffic with nowhere to go. I slammed into this lady's back end of her Trailblazer at about 75. I don't wear seatbelts, so I bounced the hell around inside, hitting my windshield and blowing out my driver's window with my face, and I hit her so hard that our cars bounced apart and my vehicle almost went off the edge into the water, as a big river was next to the highway. The front end of my vehicle was crushed all the way to the windshield. Nothing left, really. Sorry, I'd like to keep this part short. I got a grade 3 concussion, a contusion on my forehead the size of a cantaloupe, maybe bigger. My meniscus broke, and my leg as well. I stayed in the ICU for 2 weeks. I didn't get to go back to school that year, and was hospital homebound because I was so messed up I could barely walk from torn muscles and fractured in my legs. I was having seizures, and doctors were afraid of me bumping my head, saying I could easily die. So I stayed in a wheelchair for a few months at home. So yeah, I never got to play football again, and I lost my scholarship, and couldn't help but think, for the love of God, did this happen to me because I'd asked the Ouija board about it, and it had said that it would happen? If I never would have asked, would it have happened? Long story short, don't ever mess around with Ouijas. Be very careful for those of you who do. And above all else, wear your goddamn seatbelts, people. So I'm 17. One of my best friends committed suicide very recently. Times have been really rough. Ever since that day that I heard the news, I've been extremely sad and suicidal myself. And weird things started happening in my house, with objects flying across the room, footsteps, and finding things in strange places. Yesterday, my sister and her friend, 16 years old, wanted to make a Ouija board to just mess around with for fun, and try to talk with whoever was in the house. I was like, what the hell, why not? And I didn't actually believe in this stuff much at all. We made one out of paper. Me, Tilly, and Ebony sat there asking questions. It did nothing. It never worked when Tilly or Ebony were trying to be the medium, so I tried it. I began asking questions, and it started to move, and we began to feel strange sensations in our bodies, and felt a strong force on the planchette. We all looked at each other in confusion, as we watched it spell out various words, as we were all sitting there, accusing each other of moving it on purpose. We all got freaked out, and moved it to goodbye. I thought if we could make contact that easily, would we be able to contact my dead friend? I began thinking hard about my friend, and said that if he was still there, to make himself known. It began to move again, at a different speed. With my left hand I wrote down the letters. It spelled out, back to friends. It then slowly spelled out, I love you. And I wrote it on the paper. I was in tears. I felt like he was with me. I asked if he was okay, and the planchette shot up to yes. My friends and I were so shocked and freaked out. It was very emotional. I asked if there was a message for me to pass on to your loved ones. We watched the planchette move all the way back down to the bottom corner of the page where I had written I love you, and it stopped there. He then moved to goodbye. We told my mother in shock of what happened. She didn't believe us, so I said, okay, try it with us. We sat at the table. She tried to be the medium, and it didn't work. I was the medium again. We wanted to talk to my grandma. Mum wanted me to ask if it was her doing things in this house, so I did. I felt the strange sensation again. The planchette moved to yes. I asked why she was here. My name is Bailey, and my nan used to call me Bay as a child. We watched it spell out, and wrote down, help Bay sad. We were so amazed and freaked out. I asked her if she had any advice for me. It started moving. She said, smile, laugh, pray. It'll be okay. Then moved to goodbye. I don't know what to make of this experience. I'm so mind blown. I can't believe that this is possible. It's changed my perspective of life, and I'm never going to forget about it. The end is not really the end. It meant so much to know that my friend is okay and that he still loves me, and that my nan is watching over me. I can honestly say it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. I don't think I'm going to mess with Ouija boards again, because what this experience has taught me, it seems that spirits can be easily drawn, and therefore my chance of letting in something evil would be likely quite high. I'm just sharing this story now, because I feel like it's too good and too amazing not to share. Me and a couple of friends live at the very edge of our neighborhood, the edge of town, and behind our houses is a seemingly endless sea of forest. I kid you not. I've walked for hours in several directions and never reached the end. On Google Maps, it may as well be a state park. Anyway, We have explored these forests countless times, and in our minds were always incredibly safe places to walk along. Some people took their dogs, other people liked to ride their bikes, others liked to hike. Everyone in the area knew this was the place to be if you wanted to go for a long walk, especially us. One afternoon, we had taken our paintball guns and gone out for a massive session down in the woods. There was a part that was quite remote, that we knew very well and often played at. This was our first time there in a few months, and after we'd finished our session, we were cooling off with a drink before making our way back, when we noticed something peculiar on the ground. It was ash, candles, and the remains of some papers. Whoever was here had left candles that had almost fully run out of wax, and just left the small little metallic containers on the ground. We looked around, quite confused. It didn't look very old, as it hadn't been covered in leaves yet, as this was the fall. We assumed this must have been only a few days old. My friends and I joked that it must be the local Satan worshippers, despite the fact that we knew nothing of the sort existed in our area. One of us then said that we should have a stakeout and see if they come back in the middle of the night. We all laughed and dismissed it, and went back home and kind of forgot about it. Well, a few months later, in the news, dogs and cats started disappearing. Our town paper was full of these reports that there were these serial pet abductors on the loose. No one really knew what was going on. Now that you're listening, you've probably pieced it together. And yep, that is exactly what happened. You heard me. It was the people, cult, Satanists, whatever you want to call them, that would meet near where we played paintball in the woods, that would take these pets and kill them. I'm not really sure what they did. I don't like to know the details. But one day, when we decided it would be time for another round of paintball, this was already about May, did we go over to our regular place and see that it had changed significantly. There were now plastic chairs, as well as a much bigger fire pit for whatever rituals they were trying to do, as well as some fresh mounds of dirt scattered along the side. Some looked like they had been trampled. We were worried and called the cops. They took a long time to get out because we were now very remote, and I heard back later that they had found the cadavers and skeletons and charred remains of pets. These cult members had taken these pets, abducted them from front lawns or whatever, and set them on fire, or slit their throats and used their blood. This is just speculation now. I truly don't know what went on, as I was spared the details. But it certainly creeped us out. Safe to say, we strayed from those woods for a while, and we found another place to play paintball. I think it's better that way. I don't think they ever caught the cultists. Maybe we should have done that stakeout after all. I am a 38-year-old male, and this happened to me when I was about 20. I was off to college. I need you to be aware that I possessed a driving license, but hadn't needed to use it since I passed my test. You see, both my parents were retired. I was the product of two divorcee parents who had separate families, who got together and had one last kid, me. I was spoiled as hell, and they'd always drive me around, so there was never any need to drive myself, apart from maybe one or two odd occasions. Point being, I wasn't all that confident behind the wheel, despite passing my test. Now this happened when I was at college. I'd met a really interesting guy called Alfred, and we got along great. We had loads of debates between ourselves about philosophy, science, religion, and everything. He was truly my best friend. It was around spring break, just a few weeks before, that we thought it would be a fantastic idea to do a road trip. Alfred was the one who suggested it, and I was all for it. I'd never done a road trip before, but the way he'd planned it out, we'd be stopping in really remote areas all across various states to try and see some of its natural beauty. One part in particular that he wanted to see was the desert. So, as time went on, the days got closer to our road trip. We made sure we put in all necessary preparations, and we went ahead. Bear in mind, this was in the days before prolific internet use, so we had to make all our reservations in advance via the telephone, which we did. The first 4 days were absolutely great, but on the 5th day, we had to reach a desert-side motel right outside the city. We knew that it was far, and truth be told, we had stayed in our last city for a bit too long. At least the desert was on the outskirts and by the highway, so it wasn't too hard to get to. Now this particular stretch of road that we had decided to travel on was more for the sake of its beauty than the speed that we would be going at. Albert was convinced that it was a more valuable use of our time, even if it would cost us an extra hour or two. During the daylight, I agreed, and it was a moonless night, so it was nigh impossible to see into the distance. I really wish I could have. I'm sure it would have been a very stunning sight. We drove, and that's when we got the indication that we were running out of gas. Now, many of you are thinking, we probably should have taken additional gas in the back, or been quite sensible when traversing a desert highway. You'd think so, right? And you'd be wrong. Truth is that we had been quite stingy, and only really wanted to fill up when necessary. Don't ask why, I still don't know. As we were driving, we realized that the gas meter was getting ever lower, and we were starting to get worried. Consulting our maps, we looked, and there seemed to be a gas station not too far ahead, maybe about 10 miles or so. We knew we could easily make it. When we arrived, there was nothing. I mean, there was a gas pump, sure, and what looked like a very small shop. However, it was closed, and it was about 11 p.m. at this point. We were starting to get scared. What did we do? Did we leave cash on the doorstep and try to fill up the pump? Or what? We were nervous, so we decided to wait in the car and see if anyone would come. We went up and knocked on the door. There was no answer. We were starting to get afraid. We weren't sure if we should just stay the night and sleep here instead, and lose our hotel reservation. Here's another thing. The lights were on. Just 2. And it would occasionally flicker. I don't know the word for these kind of lights, but they're these long tube lights, and it would give off this very creepy vibe. We opted that we should just stay in the car and have a nap until someone came in the morning to open up the gas station. I mean, there was no one else around. It was desert and nothing. So, feeling safe enough, we reclined in our seats and tried our best to have a night in the car. I wish we'd had blankets. The car was deathly cold, and we didn't want to leave the engine running for heating in case we ran out of gas and this place didn't open. Now that would be a problem. So, I pass out. At 3 a.m, something's bugging me, and I wake up and the door is wide open. The lights at the gas station are now off, and it's almost impossible to see. I start squinting in the dark, seeing if I can see anyone, but there's nothing. Just the cold desert air entering the car, soaking my body in cold. I open the door and look around, still not seeing anyone. I assume the lights must have been sensors, because at that very moment did they flicker back to life, and my surroundings were illuminated, a seeming safe haven of light in the infinite sea of dark that surrounded me. I could make out a few things, but not much. Where had he gone? Why had he gone? I looked around the back of the place. He wasn't there. I tried the door handle of the gas station, and it didn't open. It was still locked. There wasn't even a sign, but taking a closer look into the window, I could still see lights illuminating their cold drinks fridge, which gave me hope that someone would be here in the morning. I checked to see if there was perhaps a toilet, and there was, and when I shouted, there was no response. I waited and waited and waited in the car, eventually just falling asleep and waking up in the morning. I woke up, almost not remembering what happened earlier that night, and when I looked to my right, no one was there. Where the hell had he gone? A growing feeling of dread hit the pit of my stomach like a brick, and I bolted out the car and asked myself if maybe he'd just gone into the gas station moments before I woke up, trying to not disturb me. I looked around. He wasn't there. I did buy gas, filled up, bought some snacks, threw them in the car, and checked the toilets. Nothing. No one. I asked the girl behind the counter if she'd seen my friend. She said that she saw me there when she arrived, but didn't want to disturb me, and that she hadn't seen anyone else. I was getting very, very scared, and I asked if they had CCTV by any chance. She confirmed, and seeing as there was no one else around, humoured me in looking through it. We looked through the dull grey images until we found the moment when the car door opened and he just kind of walked out and left. He went off down the road. I thought maybe he'd gone mad. Maybe something had happened. He was walking in the direction that I was supposed to be driving. I thanked the girl, gave her a 20, and bolted off in the car, driving as fast as I could. I tried to do some quick math, assuming that he'd walk at a couple of miles an hour, that he couldn't be that far down. I drove, and I drove, and I drove, and I drove, and I kept on going. At this point, I'd already driven about 3 hours, and there was no sign of him. I made sure to look on each part of the road, and up and down the desert. There wasn't like there was anyone here to stop me from going as fast as I wanted, or as slow as I wanted, or to take the occasional break and shout into the distance. When I got to the motel that we were supposed to be staying at, did I park up the car in the parking lot and have a panic attack? What the hell happened here? I actually have no clue. So I walked in and apologized to the lady about the reservation. She didn't seem to mind, and I explained how we got stranded at the gas station that was closed. She said it was no biggie, that there weren't many people here anyway, but thanked me for telling her. I asked on the off chance that my friend had arrived and perhaps checked in the middle of the night. She looked around and said that no one had come. I was getting a very bad feeling. I decided to call the police, and they took a while to arrive, and upon doing some investigation, came up with inconclusive results. I don't know what happened. I didn't finish the rest of the road trip. I drove the car very nervously back to college, parked it up, and went to my dorm. It was then that I was greeted by his sullen girlfriend, who was shrieking at me that she had just received word from his parents that he had been found alive. At the very same gas station, mind you, that they'd received a call and gone and fetched him immediately. He was the one who was apparently confused. He asked why I'd just abandoned him at the gas station and driven off. He was very pissed. But after careful explanation, did his parents explain that he had been missing for a while, and according to them, gave them a look as if they had gone insane. I drove down to his parents' house as quickly as I could, and when I was met with him, he demanded an explanation to what had happened. I explained. I'd woken up at 3, checked, and he was gone. I looked around and he was nowhere to be seen. In the morning when the gas station opened up, we checked the cams, and it showed that he just walked off into the distance, and that I knew nothing after that, and that I drove along the highway in a desperate search attempt, even reaching the shady motel, and to receive nothing, that the police had looked for him, and he was missing. He told me that that was impossible. He'd got up and decided to go for a little stroll to clear his head. He needed some air, and just wanted the cold air to refresh him, so he walked in the desert a bit. When he saw something in the distance, it was a cave-like structure. He was bored, had a flashlight, and thought he would go investigate. It's important to note at this point that he said that the skies were clearing up, and there was plenty of moon visibility. When he reached the small cave, he found nothing of interest, but decided to have a sit down as he was a little wary. He inevitably passed out, and woke up some time later. He got up out of the little cave, checked his watch, and realized it was 8 a.m. He wasn't sure if I'd be awake yet, but was fairly certain that I would wait for him, as it was out of his character to just goof off like that. But when he got back, did he realize that a lot of time had passed, more so than he had expected. He thought it was the cashier just messing with him, telling him that he'd been missing for a while, and when he called his parents to ask what the hell was going on, did they frantically drive down to collect him. We were so confused. Once he told me this, I asked him if he was sure nothing else had happened, and he was positive. He said he found that rock extremely uncomfortable, but just did it because he couldn't be bothered to do the walk back. I don't know what to believe. How can someone lose nearly a week of time and not even realize? He certainly wasn't asleep for that long. I mean, he would have died of dehydration. He's one of my closest friends, and I'm not sure whether I should believe him or not. His sincerity and everything about his demeanor said to me that he had certainly spent that amount of time doing what he said he has. But it's impossible, isn't it? I just want to share a story that happened to me when I was in grade school. I was about 10 when my great-grandma passed away. We were very close to her, since she only lived a few blocks away from where we live. She has been a lover of the paranormal, and practiced Wicca when she was younger, along with her younger sisters. So anyway, she's cool and all, and her passing devastated me and my sister. One day, while the adults were busy preparing for her funeral, we decided to visit our great-grandma's house, along with 2 of our cousins, to play and do a little bit of treasure hunting in her basement. Along with her old witchcraft items, we found an old Ouija board, one that is made out of solid wood and has a nice glossy finish. I remember her telling us that it wasn't a game for kids, but since we missed her a lot, we hoped that we could try to talk to her through it, and all of us decided to give it a try. We placed the board on a table, set our hands on the planchette, and started asking questions, unsure if we would get an answer. After 10 minutes or so, when my cousin had given up, and only my sister and I were playing, did the planchette start moving. Instantly, we both knew it wasn't our grandma, because the thing that was talking to us was sinister and said some pretty terrifying things. "I'll kill you. Murder. Need blood." Out of fear, my sister and I flipped the board over, like an immediate reaction or something, and tossed the planchette as far across the room as we could. We then scampered back into the living room upstairs, leaving our confused cousins behind. They followed us to the living room after locking the basement. We told them what happened, and after a few attempts to calm us down, my sister and I gave in, that thinking it was all over. We even agreed that we'd sleep there together since our parents were preoccupied anyway. At around 2 or 3 a.m, my cousin, who was sleeping beside me, woke me up to the smell of rotten eggs. The smell was so powerful, I thought it would stick to my clothes. We contemplated what to do first, and after a minute of silence, my sister said, "What the hell? I'll check on it if you boys don't want to," and walked out of the room. She had always been like that, the type who wants to get things over with, so we allowed her to do it. After inspecting some of the areas where the smell might be coming from, she returned, disappointed. The area was clean, as expected. Thinking there nothing more we can do about it, we forced ourselves to go back to sleep. However, not more than 30 minutes later, a loud crash from somewhere in the room, followed by my cousin's high-pitched screaming, was heard. I was the only one next to him, so I immediately sat up in a panic, followed by the other. I saw him on the floor crying, saying that someone or something with cold, bony hands grabbed his foot and dragged him off the bed. Probably at the same time we heard the crashing noise. My other cousin rushed to the main switch and flooded the room with light. What we saw shocked us. The Ouija board, along with the planchette, laid there on the hardwood floor, facing the beds we were sleeping on. The loud sound that we heard was probably the sound of wood falling flatly on another wood. The 4 of us wasted no time and dashed out of the house with the door open. We went to our great aunt, our great-grandmother's sister, who was living a few houses away. We rammed on the door while screaming and pleading until she opened up. When we explained what happened, her face went pale and ran towards our great-grandmother's house with a few of her stuff without hesitation. Remember that she, along with our great-grandmother and another sister of theirs, used to practice Wicca and some other witchcraft things, so she probably knew what was going on. An hour or so later she returned, and we received a scolding from her, but not after giving us something to eat, like a typical grandma. She said we could get an attachment if we played with that again, and that it could lead to an eventual possession. I don't care if she exaggerated on some parts of it or not, but the terror I felt was legit. We never even looked at a Ouija board again after that. I was hunting with a friend of mine, Tom, deep in the mountains of North Carolina. We went to the top of a ridge to get a good look at the area and try to pick a likely place to find some pigs. I saw a dirt road to the east, a fire trail actually, and was about to write it off when I noticed a row of campers driving along it. They disappeared behind a hill at the edge of the valley. I scanned the valley floor and found several other campers near the tree line. Tom suggested we go over to see if they would share a meal and a warm fire with 2 worn-out hunters. It was dark by the time we got over the hill, and they disappeared behind, so we climbed up to get a good last bearing and a distance estimate, and what we found was surreal. About a half a mile away, in the middle of the clearing, was a bonfire. Instinctively, we both dropped to the ground and crawled for some brush for cover overlooking the valley. I scanned the area looking for the camp and any security they might deploy. Tom surveyed the other side of the valley. When he grabbed my arm, I turned and followed his gaze. There were two groups of people standing near the edge of the valley right below us. One was wearing black hoods and robes, the other white. A figure carrying a staff was wearing a red hooded robe, walked out of the trees towards the fire, and the others followed in two single file lines. At the fire, the red figure stopped and raised his arm. The black robes circled clockwise, and the white robes counterclockwise, until they completely encircled the fire, alternating black and white. We could hear chanting, but we couldn't make out words. After about an hour of chanting and walking about the fire, first in one direction, then in the other, they stopped, and a naked man was brought out from the tree line, bound and blindfolded. He was presented to each of the robed figures clockwise around the fire, before being presented to the figure in red. He was then made to lie down at the red figure's feet. Then, a naked bound woman was brought out, and the process was repeated counterclockwise before she was laid next to the naked man. I, at least, had no idea what I was watching or what I should do. There was more chanting and then silence as four black-robed figures emerged from the tree line, carrying a black robe much like a flag. They circled the fly clockwise, once behind the figures and once in front of them. Each black figure touched the robe as it passed. When they arrived at the red figure, they stopped over the naked man. The red figure said something, and the other responded. He then pointed his staff at the naked man, and the four laid the robe on top of him. Another chant, and a white robe was brought out, and the process was repeated, counterclockwise, stopping over the naked woman. The red figure said something, and the other responded. He then pointed his staff at the naked woman, and all four laid a robe over her. The red figure waved his hand and staff over them, and raised the staff over his head. The robe-bearer then picked up the robes as they had before, and the two rose from the ground. The robe-bearers then lifted the robes over their heads, and the two then circled the fire twice, embracing each member. First the robes of their colour, and then the other. When they got back to the red figure, he pointed towards the camp with his staff, and the new members led the procession back to camp. I watched them enter the tree line, then looked back to the fire for the red figure. He hadn't moved. When the last couple was out of the clearing, the bonfire flashed green, then red, and the red robe collapsed on the ground. We humped all the way back to our truck that night. We were too scared to stop. The next morning we stopped at a Denny's for breakfast. We had put out more than 60 miles between us and that clearing and felt safe. While we were eating, two couples came in. One sat behind Tom and the other behind me, so that each of us saw them. They just smiled at us while we ate. When we left, we saw two campers in the parking lot. Tom and I never spoke about that night, and we found a better hunting area far away from that clearing. It's been nearly 40 years since that night, and every once in a while, I come across a couple in a camper, and they just smile at me. I live in a small town on the border of Texas and Mexico. I was always raised to be very independent, and had just learnt to drive at the age of 12. I was a late in life child, and my father died when I was young, so it was just my mother and I. At 14, I was a pretty good driver, because I had been driving for a couple of years, but I was still a kid. Anyway, my family in Fort Worth had an emergency, and my mother decided that I was going to drive us up there. My mother didn't drive, so I was going to be doing the driving from the border to Fort Worth, which is an 8-hour drive at 14 years old. I was a little afraid, and so I got a church friend of mine to go with me. He was cool, about 35 and a recovering alcoholic. Since it was an emergency, we took off at about midnight. Since I wasn't experienced at driving on freeways, only country roads, we decided to take nothing but small town highways. There are 2 Texas cities that connect with a small road that is so old it's rather creepy at night. You just have 2 lanes and no shoulder. At one point, the road crosses a river, and the lanes get even smaller. Honestly, only 1 car can pass the river at a time. It's more like a lane and a half than 2. It's okay though, because it's only about 20 yards to cross the river. And when the river is flooded, there is no way to get through, because the bridge would be underwater. No guardrails or anything, so you can just drive your car in the river if you choose to. So at about 2 or 3 in the morning, my mother, my friend and I are travelling down this creepy, lonely, deserted road in the middle of nowhere. Of course, I'm driving because at 14 I owned my own car and was going to drive my damn car. After almost an hour of not seeing another vehicle on the road, we noticed that there's a truck coming in the opposite direction. Let me clarify. We saw headlights coming. I noticed and anticipated it reaching us at a certain time because of how fast they were going. But it took longer than I expected. I realized it was because they stopped moving and just stopped in the middle of the highway. When I finally passed them, they were a full stop and made a U-turn as soon as we passed. This was creepy because we were the only 2 cars out of the road. They suddenly gained on us and stayed right behind us. All of us are awake and incredibly nervous, even though we haven't spoken about what was happening. But it was a big truck, and we were in a low regular sedan, so the headlights were flooding the car with illumination, and honestly, just blinding us. Finally, my friend says to slow down and let them pass. I came down to about 30, and the truck would not pass, and stayed right on my ass. That's when I realized I needed to go to the other extreme, and started driving at 75. This was hard to do in a small meandering country road, as you would expect. They were on my ass the whole time. They kept up with me when I was going fast and slowed down. I did it several times, and they wouldn't pass me, and just stayed right on my ass. Then, after a while of us sweating bullets, and deciding what would be our last stand, some lights started flashing from the truck. It was really strange, because it wasn't an obvious marked police or government vehicle. I do remember it was a Chevy truck with a half camper in the back, where you can put a bed. It was easy to recognize because my cousin had one just like it, and it was awesome. So we're dealing with flashing lights, as if a cop is trying to pull us over. My friend immediately says, "Don't you dare pull over. This could just be a bunch of drunk rednecks who decided to outfit the truck with some flashing lights and want to have some fun with us before calling it a night after getting drunk while hunting. Who knows what they're gonna do." After a couple of minutes of going back and forth, I finally decide to pull over. And then, we sat there until they decided to get out of the truck. One got out of each side of the truck and came up to my vehicle. Finally, there's a knock on the window, and they asked us for documents because they were Border Patrol. I don't know whether to get off and hug them, because they weren't crazy people trying to hurt us, or smack them for scaring the crap out of us. They were in an unmarked vehicle for better undercover surveillance, so as soon as they checked us out, we left and continued on our way. Even though we were driving at night, that adrenaline rush kept us going until the end of the trip. I went turkey hunting with my dad in the Shawnee National Forest several years ago. I was about 10. We took one afternoon to hike and scout hunting spots. Along the trail, we saw a few blood spatters and drips. Not a big deal. It's nature. About a quarter of a mile up the trail, however, we come up to 3 dogs hanging from a tree, gutted, bled out, and skinned. Okay, now that was pretty weird and scary. We keep going a bit further, as there was a bluff not too far away that was pretty cool to look at. We come to the bluff and find weird symbols burned in the ground and on the side of the rock wall. Candle wax absolutely everywhere, and more blood all over the ground. By that time, my dad, whom I've never seen scared in my life, looked at me and said, "Let's go." And we took off at a pretty big pace back to the camp. The worst part is that we didn't leave the campsite that night, so I laid awake in the camper freaking out at every sound I heard. I still get goosebumps thinking about that event to this day.